What are the gaps and challenges in addressing trafficking during the pandemic?
Law enforcement having a 50-50 workforce during the pandemic situation with accompanying various security protocols in traveling from one place to another, especially in going to provinces that have to be strictly observed to prevent the spreading of the pandemic, is one of the factors affecting the operation of the law enforcement in fighting trafficking in persons.
The present situation even added to challenges already being encountered by government agencies in addressing the OSEC problem. It limited movements and access to certain areas, which impedes the conduct of investigation and operation. There is also the issue of subjecting all arrested persons to swab testing prior to detention and the rescued victims prior to delivery to an aftercare facility. In addition, government agencies must exert extra caution in looking after themselves and their peers to avoid acquiring the deadly virus. Another challenge is the issue with the internet service providers. Republic Act number 9775 or the Anti-Child Pornography Act of 2009, particularly Section 9 thereof, have imposed certain obligations upon ISPs. Among them is the installation of available technology, program, or software to ensure that access to or transmittal to any form of child pornography will be blocked or filtered. In this regard, the National Telecommunications Commission is mandated to promulgate rules and regulations for the implementation of the said provision. As correctly observed by the Department of Justice Office of Cybercrime, 11 years after the law that prohibits any form of child pornography was passed, the ISPs continued to be remiss in its duty to install blocking or filtering technology that would have greatly reduced the amount of time necessary to identify perpetrators and victims and proactively remove access to any form of OSEC in the internet.
Due to the imposition of community quarantine, there were limitations in the movement and gathering of people. A lot of lined-up advocacy activities for 2020 were canceled and most were conducted online. However, not everyone has access to stable internet connection. Another challenge is that most of the resources and priorities of the local government units were focused on their responses to the pandemic.
The strict implementation of anti-trafficking laws and policies are taking back seats as government agencies are being mobilized to put greater efforts in social amelioration to address the needs of the affected population and health-related programs to contain the virus. This has further limited their capacity and resources to investigate human trafficking cases. Even before the pandemic, cases of human trafficking for sexual and labor exploitation are happening, and in the fishing industry are often unreported. The challenge is how to encourage vulnerable groups of children, women, and fishers to recognize their rights, take action, and report suspected cases of trafficking in persons and forced labor on fishing vessels, especially during this time.
While the Bureau is not directly monitoring trafficking in persons, our inspection activities under Article 128 of the Labor Code of the Philippines, which is our tool in monitoring compliances of all establishments, including those working in commercial fishing vessels, were greatly affected by dangers posed by COVID-19 pandemic. At early months of the pandemic, we temporarily suspended the deployment of our labor inspectors to safeguard not only their health and safety, but also of those workers and employers in the establishments that they will be inspecting. In addition, the lesser number of personnel reporting to the office makes it more difficult for us to coordinate matters across the regions. Moreover, the existing policies and programs were challenged considering the effectiveness or relevance of the current situation. At present, we are glad to report that the department has resumed its inspection activities throughout the country to ensure compliances and correction should there be any violation.
noteworthy that every time a public health emergency arises, instead of appreciating the increased level of vulnerability of our OFWs as a mobile population, what sticks is the stigma attached to them as carriers of the virus or the disease. And this only happens quite a lot to migrant workers and not as much to other mobile populations that cross international borders. This is aggravated by the lack of timely and accurate information on what the health emergency is all about, how it can be managed, prevented, and treated. Hostile attitudes and unwelcome reception of our migrant workers will only drive them towards traffickers who can only offer false support and sympathy to them.
During the pandemic period, a lot of destination countries close their boundaries and they issue travel restrictions. And because of this, a lot of our OFWs who should have left our shores, our country, for deployment abroad were stranded here in Metro Manila. So that was a very big problem for the POA. The agencies are also very much involved in this stranded, so to speak, OFWs, because technically speaking, they are not yet considered OFWs under POA rules and regulations kasi hindi pa po sila nakakaalis. In order to address this gap, the POA Governing Board came out with a Governing Board resolution. Ito po yung GBR number 11. GBR number 11 made reference to the IATF resolution on the definition of LSI. So the GBR reso says that the LSI refers also those stranded OFWs that were supposed to be deployed by the PRAs. We reiterated under that GBR the responsibility and duty of the PRA, number one, to monitor the stranded LSIs, number two, to render assistance to whatever needs they have, particularly the food and accommodation while they stay in Manila, and to assist them in transporting them back to their respective provinces until the time that they will be able to be deployed again.
The pandemic caused a sharp decrease in the number of travelers who claims their intention is for tourism but will eventually work without proper documents abroad. However, there are still some passengers intercepted by both the primary and secondary inspectors of the Bureau of Immigration at ports of exit who presented dubious travel documents such as seaman's book, letter invitations, affidavits of support and guarantee or AOSG, and the like. It has also been observed that some would present valid employment papers such as an overseas employment certificate but without the appropriate work visa. Another challenge faced by the Bureau is the lack of manpower brought about by COVID-19. The Bureau of Immigration is still running on a skeletal workforce in order to maintain proper social distancing to protect both the general public and the BI personnel from the infection. Detection of PIP schemes also became challenging since they have adjusted their employees online, which makes it fairly difficult to track.
I think the greatest gap and challenge for us is how to get back to our optimum capacity and efficiency in terms of providing services to our OFWs and monitoring their conditions and situations. So we have already, within the IACAT and even within posts outside of the country, we have started to establish a working referral mechanism that I think for the past years, for the past 6 months that we have been doing it, we have improved in terms of how we are doing it, how we are coordinating. Suddenly, all of these mechanisms that we have built on, it looks like it has been eradicated because of the pandemic. You know, right now we still have difficulty accessing repatriates because of definitely the health and safety protocols that we have to follow. We also need to point out the increasing vulnerability of frontline workers. And I keep on talking about vulnerability, but right now it's in the context of frontline workers. I know how often, you know, in the past how many months we've been under quarantine restrictions. There have been like almost monthly, the airport task force is being forced into lockdown because some members are getting infected. The DFA, those who are from Uumwa, have also been infected. Even people within the, you know, POEA, all of those who are at the front line are being affected. So there's really a situation which lessens our capacity to really help.
Majority of the systems that we have in place still focus on regular routes. Even in the British Embassy, the programs that we have are in coordination with the Bureau of Immigration, with airports, with other foreign missions, on how we can review visas, or how we can coordinate with airports to ensure that there's no one that's illegally trafficked. But very little action is being done in addressing exit borders that are not closely monitored by government. So that's one. The second one would be data gathering is really a problem right now, which is problematic because it gives us no baseline on what we can do, no disaggregated data on what we can do that could help us assess what we can do to better address the trafficking in person situation in the time of COVID.
For the first 3 months of our quarantine, most of our repatriated workers are really complaining about the number of weeks they have to stay in OWA accredited accommodation. And number two, when they finish the quarantine here in Manila, they have to be quarantined again in the local government, even they're already negative in the swab test. So these are the really challenges that we met. And now, at the start of the recruitment, our challenges again is about the coming in of the workers from the province to Manila. Number two is the TESDA. Now, the TESDA is lessen the number of attendees.
I just wanted to look at that from the private sector because it's actually important, because the private sector, licensed recruitment agencies are important partners in ensuring a regular migration pattern. It's actually more difficult if we allow workers to go overseas without being documented. And one way of being properly documented is through the private recruitment agencies. So any challenge that the private recruitment agencies would be experiencing could actually impact the migration pattern, so to speak, and would have an impact, or at least would have an effect on possible victims of trafficking.